The Thimble and the Thorn, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with something small enough to be overlooked, a simple sewing thimble and a single sharp thorn. Both were found in a quiet cottage in St. Mary Mead, placed where they did not belong, and noticed only because Miss Marple has a habit of seeing what others ignore. At first, they seem harmless, tools of a peaceful, ordinary life. But as Miss Marple considers their presence, she begins to suspect they were left not by accident, but part of something carefully arranged. Because a thimble protects, and a thorn wounds. Together, they tell a story someone never intended to be understood. As the village carries on with its quiet routines, Miss Marple follows these small, curious clues toward a truth far more dangerous than their simplicity suggests. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the tiniest objects can point to the darkest secrets. Before we uncover what the thimble and the thorn truly reveal, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Thimble. The rain had been falling since early morning, not loud, not wild, just steady, the sort that seeps into everything without permission. By the time Miss Marple arrived in Thornbridge, the village looked as though it had been sitting in silence for too long. She hadn't come for anything serious, just a visit, a few quiet days away, though, truth be told, quiet places often had the loudest secrets. Rosewood Cottage stood at the far end of a narrow lane, half hidden behind a hedge that had grown a bit too wild for its own good. It wasn't neglected, exactly, just not loved the way it once might have been. Mrs. Eliza Harrow opened a door before Miss Marple had the chance to knock twice. "You must be chilled," she said quickly, stepping aside. "Do come in." Her voice was pleasant, practiced, but her eyes, they moved too much, not resting, not settling, as though they were always checking something just out of sight. Inside, the drawing-room was warm enough, though the fire had begun to sink into itself. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, mixed with something older, dust, perhaps, or the quiet weight of time. Everything was tidy, carefully so, chairs aligned, cushions straight, nothing out of place. Nothing, except one thing. A thimble. Small, silver, sitting alone on the mantelpiece, not tucked away in a sewing box, not lost among other bits and pieces. No, it had been placed there, deliberately. Miss Marple paused just long enough to notice. "Such a pretty little object," she said lightly, moving a step closer. "One doesn't often see them displayed like that." Mrs. Harrow's answer came at once, too quickly. "Oh, that! It's nothing at all. Just something old I've had for years." Nothing at all. Miss Marple gave a soft hum, because, in her experience, things that were nothing at all rarely sat in such plain view. She didn't touch it, not yet, but her eyes lingered just a moment longer. The silver had dulled slightly with age, but along the rim there were faint markings, worn down as though fingers had traced them over and over again. Not decoration, not quite. Something else. Behind her, Mrs. Harrow shifted again, a small movement, but telling. "You must sit down," she said. "I'll make some tea." "Yes, thank you," Miss Marple replied gently, taking a seat by the window. From there she could see both the garden and the mantelpiece. The rain tapped softly against the glass, the sort of sound that fills a room when no one is speaking, and yet even when Mrs. Harrow returned with the tea tray, the silence didn't quite lift. She spoke, of course, about the weather, about the village, small things, safe things, but her eyes kept wandering, not toward Miss Marple, not toward the fire, toward the door, again and again, as though she were waiting or listening. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching, not staring, never that, just observing, the way one does when something doesn't quite sit right. "And you live here alone?" she asked, as if the question had only just occurred to her. "Yes," Mrs. Harrow said. A pause followed, brief but sharp. "Quite alone." Another glance at the door. Miss Marple nodded, as though satisfied. But she wasn't, because people who live alone rarely look as though they expect company. The evening wore on, the fire burned lower, the shadows in the room stretched longer, softer, but heavier somehow, and still the thimble sat there, quiet, waiting. At one point Miss Marple rose, walking slowly about the room, her gaze drifting over the shelves, the ornaments, the careful arrangement of an ordinary life. She paused near the mantelpiece again. "So curious," she murmured. Mrs. Harrow stiffened just for a second. "Is it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Such small things often are." She didn't say more. She didn't need to, because by then she was quite certain of one thing. The thimble mattered far more than anyone was willing to admit. That night passed without incident, no visitors, no sounds beyond the rain and the settling of the house. Too quiet. By morning the rain had stopped. The air felt different, lighter perhaps, or emptier. Miss Marple stepped into the drawing-room expecting to find everything just as it had been, but it wasn't. The mantelpiece was bare, the thimble gone. And after a moment, just a small, still moment, she noticed something else. The house itself felt wrong, too still. "Mrs. Harrow?" she called, her voice calm, almost gentle. No answer. She checked the kitchen, empty. The hallway, empty. The garden door stood slightly ajar, moving just a fraction with the morning breeze. Miss Marple stood there for a second, her hands folded neatly before her. Then she gave the smallest of sighs. "Oh dear," she said softly, because the thimble had vanished, and so had Mrs. Harrow. Chapter 2. The Thorn. They found her just beyond the garden wall, the place where the hedges broke into wild growth, thick with brambles and stubborn roses, full of thorns, the sort that catch at your clothes if you pass too close, or your skin if you're not careful. Mrs. Harrow lay there, half hidden among the branches, as though the garden itself had tried to keep her. Her face was pale, still, but not peaceful, no. There was something caught in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or fear that had come too late. The doctor called it unfortunate. A fall, he said. Wet ground, poor footing, a simple accident. Miss Marple didn't argue, not aloud. But she stood at the edge of the thicket a moment longer than necessary, her eyes moving quietly over the scene, taking it in, noticing what others dismissed. "Oh dear," she murmured, "people don't simply fall like that." Inspector Bellamy arrived not long after, a practical man, tidy in his thinking, the sort who preferred answers that behaved themselves. "With respect," he said, offering a polite nod to Miss Marple, "these things do happen." "Yes," she replied softly, "they do, but not quite like this." There were marks, faint but there, around Mrs. Harrow's wrist, not the thin scratches left by thorns. No, these were firmer, a grip. Someone had held her, not gently. Miss Marple said nothing more. She didn't need to, not yet. Instead, she turned her attention to the garden itself. The gate at the far end stood slightly open. odd, considering Mrs. Harrow said she kept it shut, always. And the ground nearby, soft from the rain, held the faint impression of footsteps. Not one set, two. "Did she often have visitors?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual, as though it were of no real importance. "No," the gardener said quickly, too quickly. "Never, really. Kept to herself." Miss Marple glanced at him. Just a glance, but it lingered. "Did she?" she said. The gardener shifted, looked away, said nothing more. That was the way of it, you see. In small villages, people rarely lie outright. They simply adjust the truth, smooth it over, leave bits out. Miss Marple moved slowly along the edge of the thicket, careful of the thorns. Her eyes searched the ground, the branches, the spaces in between. And then, quietly, "The thimble is missing," she said. Inspector Bellamy frowned. "The what?" "A small silver thimble," she replied. "It was on the mantelpiece yesterday, very deliberately placed." He gave a small shrug, hardly significant. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, not on its own. That was the trouble with small things. People overlooked them until they couldn't. As the day went on, she asked her questions, lightly, gently, as though she were merely passing the time. A neighbor who claimed she'd heard nothing, though she admitted, after a pause, to seeing a light in the garden late at night. A shopkeeper who insisted Mrs. Harrow rarely spoke to anyone, though she remembered, quite clearly, a man asking for directions to Rosewood Cottage just 2 days before. And always that same hesitation, that same careful choosing of words. By evening, the village felt different, quieter somehow, as though it knew something and wasn't quite ready to say it aloud. Miss Marple stood outside the small village shop, the last of the light fading behind her. It was then that a voice spoke from the doorway, low, uncertain. "The thimble," it said. It wasn't hers. Miss Marple turned, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. "Oh," she said. The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before continuing. "I've seen it before, not in her house, somewhere else, a long time ago." "A family piece?" Miss Marple asked. "No, not like that." A pause. "More like something passed along, quietly." Miss Marple nodded once, slowly. There it was, the thread at last beginning to show. Because if the thimble didn't belong to Mrs. Harrow, then it belonged to someone else. Someone who came looking for it, in the rain, through the garden gate. And if that someone had found her first, well, that would explain the thorns.
It came together slowly, not all at once, not with any grand flourish, just the quiet assembling of truth, piece by careful piece, a look that lingered too long, a word chosen too quickly, and that small stubborn detail that refused to sit quietly, the thimble. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room of Rosewood Cottage once more, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes resting on the empty mantelpiece. "It was never about the thimble itself," she said at last. Inspector Bellamy, standing by the window, turned slightly. Then what was it about? A message, or rather a sign, something arranged between two people who trusted one another. The thimble placed on the mantelpiece meant something had been hidden, something ready to be collected. Bellamy frowned. Hidden where? Miss Marple rose, slowly, as though the answer had been waiting for her all along. "In the one place no one would search too closely," she said. "Somewhere unpleasant, somewhere people avoid." She stepped outside, Bellamy following close behind. The garden was still damp from the previous day's rain, the earth soft beneath their feet. Beyond the wall the bramble thicket stood, thick and tangled just as before. "The thorns," Bellamy muttered. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "the perfect hiding place. Painful enough to discourage curiosity, but easy enough if one knew exactly where to reach." She moved forward without hesitation, ignoring the way the branches snagged at her sleeve. Her hand slipped between the thorns, careful now, precise. For a moment there was nothing. Then she drew something out. Small, dark, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, now damp and stained with soil. Bellamy leaned in. "What is it?" Miss Marple unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a narrow strip of folded paper and a small, dull key. The inspector's expression shifted. "A key?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and not a common one." She unfolded the paper. Her eyes moved across the writing, quick, sharp, certain. "Well now," she murmured, "that does settle it." "What does it say?" Miss Marple looked up. "It's a record," she said. "Names, dates, payments, quiet transactions, carefully noted, the sort of thing that ruins reputations, or worse." Bellamy's face hardened. "Blackmail." Miss Marple gave a small nod. Yes, Mrs. Harrow wasn't simply keeping something safe, she was holding leverage for someone else. And the gardener? He knew about the thimble, but not what it truly meant. He thought it led to money, something he could take, something simple. She paused. He followed her into the garden, demanded it, and when she refused, Bellamy exhaled slowly. He lost control. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "just for a moment, but a moment is all it takes." The inspector glanced at the paper again. "Then who does this belong to?" Miss Marple folded it neatly, her expression thoughtful. "Someone clever, someone who knew Mrs. Harrow wouldn't betray them easily, but might need persuading." She turned back toward the cottage. The thimble was the signal, left in plain sight so that that person would know the item was ready to be collected. They came that night, through the garden gate. "But they never got it," Bellamy said. "No," Miss Marple replied, "because Mrs. Harrow hid it before they arrived. She must have sensed something was wrong." "And the gardener saw his chance." "Exactly." A silence followed as the pieces settled into place. Bellamy straightened. "We'll need to find this person, the one behind it all." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I believe you already know them." He blinked. "I do?" "Yes," she said gently. "The shopkeeper's sister, the one who spoke of the thimble not belonging to Mrs. Harrow. She recognized it because she'd seen it used before." Bellamy's expression darkened. "She runs the accounts for half the village." "Indeed, which makes her perfectly placed to keep such records and to use them." "And Mrs. Harrow?" "A caretaker," Miss Marple replied. "Nothing more. Trusted until she wasn't." Bellamy let out a slow breath. "We'll bring her in." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I think you must." The wind stirred the hedges, light now, almost gentle. The garden no longer felt quite so heavy. But the truth had a way of doing that, lifting one weight only to reveal another. Miss Marple glanced once more at the bramble thicket, her eyes thoughtful. "So much trouble," she murmured, "over something very small." Then she turned away, her expression settling back into its usual calm, as though it had all been perfectly ordinary. But of course it never was. And if you've stayed with me this far, you know that, don't you? Small things, quiet places, harmless objects, they're never quite what they seem.
So if you enjoy stories like this, slow, sharp, and just a little unsettling, make sure you subscribe and stay close, because the next mystery might be hiding something even worse.